What's up guys, welcome to episode 11 of It's Expensive But Is It Good? Today we're looking at an incredibly rare and obscure Formula 1 game, F1 Racing Championship. Specifically, its NTSC copy, which is actually so obscure that it took a while for people to even know it wasn't just a PAL game. The reason for that is, F1 Racing Championship's NTSC version only saw a limited run in Brazil, shockingly, so it's no wonder that it took years before North American collectors would even know that it is too part of their set. We've looked at rarity examples before, let's check out some quick price charting for reference, which is good, but less than perfect since some copies seem to not make it into its data. But for the most part, you could say it's about 90% accurate. Then we get to F1 Racing. One sale per year? Now just wait a minute. That can't be right. The last and only completed listing as of the last few months on eBay went for a stiff $405, which, don't get me wrong, is a really nice, but seems like yet another example of where price has not quite caught up with the rarity. We could just sit here and admire this hard to find gem on the shelf and circle jerk about its rarity as if that's all there is to it, but we're taking this episode to places that none have ever before, finishing all 16 races of F1 Racing Championship. We understand it's expensive, it's rare, but the question to answer is it good? Right off the bat to mention, F1 Racing Championship is not an exclusive N64 title. It's actually just one of its few ports, and being on the N64 is quite the graphical and audio disadvantage compared to the second wave of 3D consoles, showing us games that we hardly thought were possible at the time. Important to mention though, F1 Racing Championship was primarily a PAL game, and its only NTSC action was on the PS1, and just barely and obscurely on the N64. I can't speak to what it's like to play through those ports, but what I can tell you is that the N64 port is a challenge straight from hell. And who knows, maybe the ones on the Dreamcast and PS2 are just as horribly unforgiving. But here on the N64, you are straight up always one bad turn away from having to restart if you ever want to clear these races. We're going to focus on the arcade mode. It's what you reach if you just pressed A from the very beginning. Interestingly enough, the music doesn't even start until you select arcade. The simulator mode, as you could guess, has a lot more going on, with much longer races and a lot more adjustments you could make. Getting into arcade mode, on the first page, the rookie, you have to get 6th or better on a race to move on. Sounds easy enough, until you realize this is a pretty stiff simulator-like game. Gear shifting, turn preparation, and turn execution are all demanded to a very high level. If you assumed you could just turn this on and get through it because you've gotten through other N64 racers, understand that this is significantly harder and different than all of them, every single step of the way. It's produced by Ubisoft, which is interesting. Ubisoft had a handful of other N64 titles. F1 Racing Championship is the type of hard that will make you wonder if you picked the wrong car. But no, this car will work just fine. It's your default choice. It just illustrates how much you have to get right with this game. It's the type of hard that makes you honestly want to just scoff at the game and say, no wonder you're rare, you're just not well made. And basically impossible as a result. Completely reasonable to feel this way? I know I did. But again, that just goes to show you how much practice you need in order to get this down. If you have this game, you could just look at it and admire the expensive game you have on your shelf, sure. But the question is, when are you going to put those excruciatingly demanding races into their place? You have to start all the way in the back of the pack, and your car can only catch the front car if you're willing to put in the time. Not even kidding, this is one of the hardest games I've ever played in my entire life. This isn't even on some broken difficulty mode either, it's just what you end up playing if you press A from the very beginning. This is their default racing arcade mode, and it comes at you with a learning curve so mighty, so treacherous, and so mentally draining, you would never see it coming how it can totally possess you with rage from these seemingly bland and innocent courses. The ranting has to do with those turns. Every number you see going down one, I'm pressing Z, and any going up, I'm pressing R. Those are going to get pressed a lot. On the 6th gear, your top end speed is at its highest, while turning and acceleration are at their worst. While first gear is the opposite with your lowest top end speed, but best turning and acceleration. And of course with every gear between them, a step in between. When you sink into it, it's a complete puzzle of a game figuring out what gears work where, managing to remember it and executing it for all 4 laps with honestly no big mistakes whatsoever. You have to play nearly flawless. in terms of not spinning out or avoiding any major slowdowns in bad terrain or repeatedly hitting the back of one of your opponents. While you have the choice of automatic or manual, of course automatic changes the gears for you, but it's just not going to get the job done. You need to do it manually. That is the mechanic that took me hours to grasp. From starting neutral at the line to its stiff and demanding control, there comes a point where you start to ask yourself, how many hours is worth it? Relatively speaking, the races are quite long. Laps are typically over a minute, sometimes near 90 seconds. And what I can tell you is, there's no mechanic like power sliding from Mario Kart 64, or letting go of the gas after going over speed boosts in Diddy Kong Racing, or it being a matter of survival at super high speeds with the constant risk-reward of using your life-draining boosts in F-Zero X. Here the difference is its stiffness and nuance with the constant, never-ending gear toggling and how you handle yourself around the wide variety of corners. You have to be so incredibly careful, it's not even funny. Although I can guarantee you, you will have to sometimes laugh to stop yourself from crying. The enormous amount of race sabotaging spinouts was just heartbreaking. And like I said, with the races being long, it's a long time to race without a major mistake, because even the worst of consequences can come from something so mild. I guess that's what a simulator-minded person might say is a beautiful thing about this game. It must be tricky and hard as crap to handle one of these Formula 1 cars in real life, but I often feel like I wish I could influence the speed and the racing of this game in just a more exciting, involved, and intense way. The races just had me tight-lipped and nervous the entire time. It took me over 90 minutes over 2 sessions before finally clearing my first race. And I wasn't finishing a race when it was already down the shitter either, so that was easily over 60 attempts. An hour and a half before finishing a race? Now that's a significant learning curve. And you might assume after the steepest of learning curves, it must have been smooth sailing from there. But no, honestly, there was only one race in this entire game that didn't take a ton of effort. This was the case in Germany, due to a couple of really tight turns that you could actually just drive right through with enough momentum. Going off track isn't usually a good idea, it slows you down tremendously. But these couple of sharp, shallow, winding turns are the exception. There are a couple more examples where you can go off track for a slight advantage, but with those courses, that ultimately just made it feel possible. Getting first in the second race, in a game that feels so undoable, leaves you kind of shell-shocked, but perhaps optimistic about continuing to see how far you can get. I can tell you they didn't spend much time making first place too exciting though. In other racing games, you feel pumped and encouraged, like you did something. But here, you're seriously greeted with the same thing as if you lost. Just the text change. Yay. For a game with long races and not a ton of visible excitement going on, it's hard to express just how difficult it is to accomplish your objectives. We've looked at a lot of hard games on this channel, and while it's in its own way, thinking about each one of these races like a stage to clear, the overall time spent and sheer number of attempts speak for themselves. While Malaysia took the first 90 minutes all on its own, clearing the second race took less than 15 minutes, which was the exception. It took another 45 minutes to get through the third race, Great Britain. Then we get to Brazil. Ironically, we have one hell of a time in the country that these NTSC copies were produced. Brazil was like a boss level of a race. I hate to admit it, but it took me almost 2 hours between 2 sessions, and while there were an ass ton of resets, like easily over 100 of them, I still finished this race twice in 7th place. Once only by a car length. Talk about a gigantic steel-toed kick to the balls. The cold hard fact is, you're not getting back to the same opportunity without 3 pristine mistake-free laps that are all over a minute each. The turns that have you slow down just early enough to avoid spinning out while not giving up too much ground are straight from hell. These situations will haunt your dreams when you keep coming back race after race after race, just because you want to win so damn bad. Eventually, I got 5th. Relieved to have gotten through it, the drain of F1 Racing Championship was not only on my time, but also on my mood. The desperation to clear a track was beyond getting to me. I wanted to quit on this journey on the first race alone, but honestly the goal of providing the most comprehensive and in-depth coverage of this rare title is what made me keep trying. Well, that, and also the chip on your shoulder that says, no, screw you game, I can do this. At some point, it just feels like a foolish battle. There are so many great games to enjoy and play through. How is F1 Racing Championship getting over 10 hours of my time? I mean, that's plenty enough to get pretty deep into an RPG or an adventure game, not to mention finish plenty of other games on their own. At a primal and chemical level, honestly, I believe I was becoming addicted. It wasn't because it was super fun, I was just so desperate to clear each and every race that the dopamine rush I got from actually doing it was so real. I'm not even exaggerating, I could feel my heart's stroke volume increasing as it was pounding harder than ever in the couple of these final stretches. I think it was even pounding harder than it did with the NES bike challenges. When you feel you've wasted hours, there's just so much on the line. When a race with legitimate chance to be the one is so hard to come by, with tens of minutes, possibly hours, of mundane attempts laced with frustrating and devastation in between them. So when we finally moved into the veteran circuit that requires you to get third or better to move on, I'm not even kidding, I thought that might be the end of our progress. But what do you know, one attempt leads to another. And another, 50 more, and somehow after getting fourth twice, equivalent to cleats stopping on your nuts, we get through Spain with a first place. Unbelievable. Then your brain tells you, well, if you can do it on one, you must be able to do it on another. And that's what the next hour was for. When getting sixth or better is what you just spent the last few hours doing on only 4 courses, you already know how much fourth place stings, like Listerine on your pee hole. As I mentioned, getting through your F1 Racing Championship in a lot of ways has been as difficult or even more so than a lot of the hardest challenges in the channel. If you think NES Hard reigns supreme, I dare you to play this game. It's such a unique level of skill. If you have a supernatural feeling for the gear shifting and the overall timing required to handle your car, or maybe you played F1 racing like this before, this just might be the learning curve that comes with the territory. But from what I've gathered, I've only seen superficial coverage on this game, and nobody talks about what it's like to beat these races. That's because it's significantly easier to put down the controller, keep it surface level, and call it a day. Australia is like the boss race of the veteran circuit. You know how much it hurts to attempt this one course for an hour and still not get it? This required a couple tricks, along with a shockingly high standard of overall execution if you're ever going to get top 8, let alone top 3. After over an hour of failure, I decided to switch over to France. This one took about 25 minutes to get through. As the courses get more tight and windy, it's a good time to point out and mention you're going to be doing most of your passing in your lower gears. You might have assumed that most of your passing would happen when you're at your top, but that's actually when the least movement happens. All of your passes have to take place as you get better and better with these turns, and seeing exactly what gear to use where to avoid letting go of A as much as possible. So after France went down, we still had Australia left. And I hate to admit it, it took me over another hour before getting through this course. There really is just that much to get right. It is some straight crap how good you have to be. I mean, do every single thing right and not make a single mistake while staying ready for the tiny shortcut path that maybe saves you 2 seconds each lap. Along with cutting off the track here since you're able to get through without major slowdown. Failure after failure, all I could do was just keep trying. And eventually, finally strung together 4 laps of the best gear shifting, turning, and acceleration possible. Now with the rookie and the veteran down, we take on the champ page. The champ page is full of some doozies, where you need second or better to move on. When you sink into this game and will yourself to get through its races, it's not a game to underestimate. It'll somehow eat your heart out while boring you to death at the same time. It's a strange and sadistic challenge that just might make you not want to pick up the controller ever again. I mean, we just had to rely on some thirds to get through. Now that same type of finish here would end up being a retry. It's a lot to wrap your head around as you try to sink in while thinking, are we seriously about to do this? We've got Monaco first, and good God, look at that map. Think we're in for some tight turns and another learning curve. That's exactly right. Monaco is a tight, windy course with multiple turns that can quickly bone your entire attempt. It's worth pointing out that this is the most unique and involved scenery yet, and that does help it be a bit more interesting. These are based on actual courses after all. When it was all said and done, this one took all of 49 minutes, basically finishing the course once and then just a butt ton of resets. That pretty much becomes the strategy: finish a course entirely once, maybe twice, then go through flurries of multiple resets until you finally get a run to finish. We get through Monaco by managing to bring this from third to second and barely holding on through the final turns to move on to the next race. Coming up next, we move on to Hungary, another race with a lot of botched turns, more getting used to quickly going up and down in your gears. Having a map, especially for a game like this, is incredibly helpful when trying to brace yourself for what's coming up, but something you will notice more and more is that the map seems to sometimes represent a track area, but not actually every little turn in the road. There will be more examples of this as we go on, and it can really throw you off when a track looks like a more mild turn than it actually is, or worse yet, when it actually looks to be straight, but is actually a bend, wiggle, or sometimes a turn. 37 minutes later, we surge from third to first in the last couple of turns to move past Hungary. San Marino is the third race on the page, and I don't know why. It always seems the case that one race on each page is just that much harder than the rest. First page had Brazil. Second page, we had Australia, and now San Marino was proving to be the next major problem. You know, it didn't feel good when I attempted for 80 minutes straight before bed without being able to finish any better than fourth by the end of it. Counterintuitively, you might assume that the more basic race shape compared to what we've seen would make it easier, but it doesn't for a couple of reasons. I mentioned earlier that you do the least amount of your passing in 6th gear. Well, that still remains true here, so your handful of turns that you do have need to be perfect. If you slow down any more than necessary, you will not catch up to the top racers in time. It's just impossible. And of course you want to stay fast, but overshooting a turn isn't an option either, since then you're off the track. And just have to point out, there's often a decent spread between the top dogs and the rear 18 to 20. It's just how it works most of the time. And that's a problem when you need second place. Another reason it's tricky, something we touched on last track, there are a couple moments where the map indicates one thing, like a straight line, while you're surprised with something else. As we've seen in a handful of other races, sometimes taking your momentum through off-road terrain can work out to be the better option. Plus it's nice to cut down on the effort of winding through more turns while gear toggling. But you just have to be really careful, because if you touch left or right even a little bit while off track, you're going to slide and probably spin out, which means a restart. So the angle of this straight line has to be really tight in order to get you back on the road before slowing down too much. There's also another important track cutting spot right here. You've got to keep your eye out for these moments, because you need everything to go your way in order to get through a race like this. After 2 more 30-minute segments, finally managed to surge into first and take down another Goliath of a race. Even though it took forever, getting first in San Marino is just another thing to keep you believing that it's all possible. The thought of being able to say we got through all of the races, it's so tempting. The last course we have on the champ page is Italy. Speaking of cutting through grass, we have a couple moments of that here. But with that being said, as always, you have to keep in mind it doesn't take much to ruin your race if you attempt to make the slightest adjustment when you're not on track. It's much easier and consistent to hit the sections this way though. It makes the passing significantly easier. Italy has a few little wiggles in its roads that you have to get used to, since they're not really reflected in the map. So that's bound to ruin some races, but once you have those down, paired with knowing how far you can push some other turns, just 25 minutes later, can you believe it? We are through the champ page. At this point, I'm hoping it's the end. I mean, we just did the champ, that's gotta be it. But no, after saving your progress, we are met with the master page, where you need first place in all 4 races in order to get through it. As sick as this made me feel, there's obviously no turning back. we're far beyond that point. Just looking at the maps, you can see the courses are as windy as ever, and at this point, this is when all of your grinding to make F1 Racing Championship almost second nature is what makes the final page possible. Canada is another stop-and-go windy course that you've just got to master for a chance. It took me 54 minutes to get through this one, had to learn exactly what gears went where, tried out and learned a decent cut-through spot, and basically it's about trying to get up into your 6th gear, then quickly shift back down, barely in time. Dealing with each turn, your execution has got to be nearly flawless at this point if you want to see through any courses on the Master, and after almost an hour, we get through Canada. The second Master race, Japan, is another jank challenging course with tight roads and many tough turns that you've got to memorize on how to deal with best. For each turn, do you have to slow down to 1st or 2nd gear? Or is it just 3rd or possibly 4th? Doing anything less than what's optimal won't have you anywhere near the right place to get first. The turns are tight, and so is the pavement, and naturally with a momentum-heavy racing game, any tires tracking through the edge of the grass more than just a couple times is enough to justify a reset. You've got to be one with the car at this point. There's no other way around it. It took 42 minutes to get through the 3rd to the last race in the game. Now we move into Belgium for the obligatory course per page that takes me over an hour to get through. And it's not like it's because I was rusty either. This is pretty fresh off of Canada and Japan. It's just a wicked and crooked whore of a course. Overall, it's not really a shock what I'm going to say at this point. The turns take memorizing, the gears take mastering, and it's another example of when the race has some really tricky, even trap-like moments when compared to the map. As you get into grinding F1 Racing Championship, a decent rule of thumb is getting into the top 10, maybe 12 racers or so by the end of your first lap, in order to set yourself up to have any realistic chance of actually winning. Spending a full 5 minutes to finish a race just to get 2nd or 3rd isn't really worth it when you keep in mind you just have to do it all again. Belgium is the race that took the longest on the master page. More tight roads and another tough course to master in order to get first and move on to the final race in the game. But it's just called Europe, like France, Germany, Belgium. But where the heck is this course in Europe? At first I thought this was the Russian flag, but it's just called Europe. But we've already been racing in Europe. There were Spain, Germany, France, Belgium, Italy. But where the heck is this course in Europe? The reason I mentioned Russia earlier is because the flag is pretty close, and sometimes Russia would get jabbed at, if not completely blueballed, in video game inclusion or references. But when looking up the flag, it's not actually Russia's, but it's the Netherlands. Is that where we are? The Netherlands? Then why doesn't it just say that? In classic downhill fashion, I was able to take my conditioned F1 racing skill into the Netherlands and get first place in only 18 minutes. Nothing incredibly unique here, just another course that I'm sure would have taken forever at the beginning, but now that our brain is physically in the gearbox of the Formula 1 car, it's hard to hold us back anymore, especially when we immediately recognize some great drive-through opportunities and handle our gearbox like an equation. What happens when we finally clear arcade mode, you ask? Well, we unlock free play on all 16 courses, and it keeps track of your high scores. For some closure, I played through the first race we started it all with, Malaysia. First time with the game, it took 90 minutes between 2 sessions to advance with 6th, but this time, at the height of our blossoming F1 grind, we're able to bring things full circle, and what do you know, managed to get first after just one try. We have officially evolved into Formula 1 Masters, just as the final page was titled. F1 Racing Championship does not have a battery save, so this memory card is holding some pretty obscure save data. Is there another memory card out there with all 16 races cleared? I'd love to see it. If F1 Racing Championship didn't take so much time and provide so much frustration, I would put more into the simulator modes. You actually have to watch the condition of your car, stop to get help from your pit crew, and to my shock, there's actually a voiced coach.
It's raining. Change to wet weather tires.
And just like real Formula 1 racing, if you don't stop to see your pit crew, your engine will blow and you will lose the race. But there's no option to retry, you have to take that loss into the rest of the circuit. I guess the reason why I don't want to spend more time with this game helps us finally answer the question. It's expensive, but is it good? In terms of how much fun you can actually have when compared to other good racers on the console, F1 Racing Championship is just not really that good of a game. The course backgrounds are pretty dull and reused, the graphics of the cars themselves are okay, the music is also okay, it's at least easy to listen to. If you have an emulator or EverDrive 64, or perhaps even a copy of this game, I'd love to know what you thought of this game as well. Have you just played it for a few minutes before out of curiosity's sake? Or have you actually put more effort into this and gotten through a couple of its races? Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.